It is my distinct pleasure to welcome you all here to the first ever Academy for Justice Distinguished Lecture featuring Professor Barry Friedman, one of the country's leading authorities on policing. My name is Adam Chodorow. I am one of the two interim deans here at the law school right now. But for purposes of this gathering, it was my pleasure to actually help lead A for J, which is what we call it for short, the Academy for Justice, for about a year and a half, and to sort of help get it off the ground and get it started. And so although I'm a tax professor, I've developed a deep and abiding love of criminal justice reform and the people who are dedicated to it. So it's really my pleasure. I can't tell you also how happy I am that we're actually here in this room doing this. The idea for this distinguished lecture first surfaced somewhere in early 2019. It was scheduled for 2020 and the pandemic, and it got put off. So the fact that we're able to be here, albeit masked, but at least here, I think is wonderful. There's nothing like getting people together. So let me tell you a little something about the Academy for Justice. It is a team of reform-minded scholars who believe that knowledge and research are the most important tools we have for addressing the litany of issues that sort of are around our criminal justice system. And what we aim to do is we aim to bridge the gap between academics and the real world. So too often people criticize academia for writing articles that only other academics read, and there's a disconnect between what the academics are doing and what's actually happening in the police departments, in the prisons, in the state legislatures, et cetera. So the goal of this organization is to bridge that gap, is to get best practices, to do the research, to have conversations with the people who are actually out there doing it, so that we can figure out ways to make the system even better. And the only way we can make it better is if we all work together. It can't be one side throwing bombs at the other, right? That's never going to work. So the idea is to take this research, translate it into understandable English, have conversations with folks like you, and move forward on reform ideas. So that's what it's all about. So the Distinguished Lecture Series is part of this, right? It's a key part of this, because what we wanted to do is we wanted to get leading experts in the field to think about a topic, write about a topic, and then have an event where we could talk about the ideas with you all. So without any further ado, I'd like to turn it over to the head of the Academy for Justice, Eric Luna, who will introduce the speaker and I'm sure give us a fabulous event. So thank you all for coming. I hope you enjoy the event. I know we all will.
Thank you. Sure. Thank you, Dean Chodorow. Thank you, Dean Chodorow. There has been no better friend of the Academy for Justice than Adam Chodorow, and we are all very grateful for his leadership through this early part of our center. It is my great pleasure, and it's perfect, the setup that Adam provided about the gap bridging aspects or the aspirations of the Academy for Justice, to introduce our first distinguished lecturer, Barry Friedman. Barry Friedman, you will see online, you can get his biography, is the Jacob D. Fuchsberg Professor of Law. He's also an affiliated professor of politics at New York University School of Law. He is one of the nation's leading scholars and authorities on policing. His book, recently published, Unwarranted Policing Without Permission, is groundbreaking and has already started a very lively discussion in this world of great change in criminal justice. You can find Professor Friedman's scholarship throughout legal academe, as well as in the popular press, from the New York Times, Slate, LA Times, Politico, the New Republic, and on and on. He is the founding director of the Policing Project, itself a very unique and important center on criminal justice reform, that one at New York University Law School. He is also the reporter of the ALI's new Principles of Policing, an important document, an extraordinarily important document that may change the way that we think about policing in America. Professor Friedman is going to help us understand and contextualize policing through the lens of the unsheltered. I want to take a very brief opportunity to contextualize Professor Friedman. Professor Friedman began his career as a scholar in con law proper, the class that you take that is called constitutional law. He's an expert and was an expert and still is an expert in judicial review. He wrote, among other things, two defining works on the counter-majoritarian difficulty, which is perhaps the principal problem of constitutional review in American democracy. As is true of great and curious intellectual minds, Professor Friedman turned his considerable talents to another issue that raises that questions of constitutional law and judicial review, but is rarely seen that way. And it is the topic known as criminal procedure or constitutional criminal procedure, or I like to call it con law 2B. His contemporaries, who are experts in constitutional law, both structure and judicial review, and in criminal procedure, are few. I think of the Yale Law professor Akil Marr as one, but I actually think there are some better analogies because of the way in which Professor Friedman himself has bridged the gap between academe and the actual on-the-ground practice of policing. Those two analogies, those two reference, are also professors or were professors in New York City. One was at Columbia, a professor named Herbert Weschler. You may know of this man only as a student because of his principal work product, among many, the Model Penal Code, which redefined the way that America looked at substantive criminal law. All you have to do is look at our own Arizona Criminal Code, and you see a mirror, to some extent, of the Model Penal Code. A second, more recent analogy is to the NYU professor, his colleague at NYU, Anthony Amsterdam. Tony Amsterdam helped redefine the death penalty through the lens of the Eighth Amendment in constitutional review. He not only had definitional scholarship, but he literally changed the jurisprudence in the Supreme Court. Barry Friedman continues that tradition. He has taken the field of constitutional law and applied it to the area that you may not think of an important area of constitutional judicial review, but in fact is the one that is most likely to come into contact with all of you. Without further ado, help me welcome our first distinguished lecturer here at the Academy for Justice, the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law, Professor Barry Friedman.
Good morning. Whatever happens from now on, you will be disappointed because I'm not sure what I deserve to have done in life to deserve that. I'm pretty sure that distinguished is a code word for old, but I'm thrilled to be here. I'm going to put this on and hope that works. Ooh, that's a lot of, is that too much of me? Because I may move around a bit. I'm delighted to be here. I want to thank Dean Chodorow for introducing Eric and me. I really want to thank Eric for that. You'll notice that somehow, magically, my slides advanced while Eric was talking, and I don't know exactly how that happened, but my first time ever in this room was at the launch of the Academy for Justice, which is an extraordinary achievement. Bringing together, this room was full of criminal justice and criminal law people from all over the country. It was very cool. They raised if you've never, I'm sure you all have seen the trick where they raised the glass doors, but for us it was really cool when it happened. You know, Eric is an extraordinary scholar all on his own, and I am very grateful to him for having me here. I want to thank Ben McJunkin and Valina Bini for helping me think through the topic for the lecture today. I want to thank Suzanne Stewart for all the work that she's done. There she is, for all the work that she's done to make today happen. I want to thank the commentators who are friends and colleagues and people I think are amazing, but their papers certainly outdid the paper that I did. I want to thank all of you for coming, interrupting your day. I know many of you are in public service, and I want to thank you particularly for being here. I am thrilled to be the inaugural distinguished lecturer, though I'm not sure I deserve the title. Adam brought up the timing of this, and I just have to do it again because it's extraordinary. I went looking through my email inbox. So Eric and I first communicated in the spring of 2019. I have an email from June of 2019 extending an invitation to come. The lecture was scheduled for February 4th of 2020. I don't even remember why we moved it the first time. It wasn't the pandemic. But I found a file from March the 3rd, 2020, where I think I was on a train in Europe working on slides for the lecture that was going to happen not that long thereafter. It obviously got moved because of the pandemic. It got moved at least once, if not two other times. Once because we were going to do this on Zoom, and finally we just said, let's forget it. Let's try to do this in person, and I am just thrilled to be here in person. I'll be honest, I haven't spoken to a crowd live this large in a long time, so bear with me. I'm grateful to all of you for having masks on. And my topic today is, are the police the key to public safety, the case of the unhoused? And what I want to do is I want to ask questions about the role that we think that the police should and best play in achieving public safety in society. And it's actually interesting in terms of the timing of this lecture, because if I had come to give this lecture when we originally had planned to have the lecture, it was a very different time. And in fact, I might have had to do more work explaining to you what my topic was even about. And I know that for a fact because I spoke to some people about the topic in the years before George Floyd was killed, and it went over their heads. It was just not clear what it was that I was trying to say. But after George Floyd was killed and after the protests that followed, a light bulb went off in the heads of many people in the country, which I'll come back to in just a moment, where they sort of understood what the nature of the topic was. So I have three parts to this talk. First, I'm going to talk about my own odyssey with these issues in the world of police reform and how I came to ask the question myself about what the role of police should be in achieving public safety. Then I'm going to get to the core of this topic, which is asking that question in the context of folks who are unhoused. And then finally, I'm going to offer up some solutions. Along the way, I'm going to introduce you, I hope, to a couple of topics. One is the idea of front-end accountability, which we'll talk about in just a moment. And the other is reimagining public safety, which you hear talked about a lot today. I actually had drafted a law review article with that title several years ago, but I decided to sex it up and called instead Disaggregating the Policing Function. I thought that would be more attractive to readers. I don't know if that worked out or not, but we're going to talk about what that means to me. And then along the way, I'm going to hope to offer us two tools for thinking through the problem. The first is to ask ourselves, what do we mean when we talk about public safety? And the other is to talk a little bit about why we do or don't use cost-benefit analysis in this space. So first, I just want to talk about my own personal odyssey with these issues. And even though my topic of the lecture is incredibly serious, I feel like it is important in the world in which we live to have a little levity in everything we do. So this is me when my book came out recently. But I have dug up a picture of me 30 years ago when I was a young constitutional law professor. Before I put it up on the screen, I can say that all I can figure out is that I had thrown on a sport jacket for the event itself, but that I was in my Parisian revolutionary stage. So that's me 30 years ago. And part of the reason I point this out, beside the humor that I hope you all are enjoying there, is it possible to lower my volume just a little bit? Yep, thank you. Is because I, for a very long time, have been concerned about the harms of policing, the stops, the frisks, the searches, the uses of force, the surveillance. And for a very long time in my career, it didn't strike me as odd that a constitutional law professor was thinking about those issues. In fact, it struck me as the most natural thing on the planet. As Eric points out, I taught at Vanderbilt, where I taught for many years, a course called Criminal Constitutional Law, or Criminal Constitutional Procedure, what we now call criminal procedure. And it was all about the Fourth Amendment and the Fifth Amendment and the Sixth Amendment, because that's the way in the United States of America that we have typically regulated policing, through the Constitution. And I think many people were of the view, and there are many more people today who are of the view, that that was not working. And I nonetheless went about doing what it was that I did, and then in 2006, a light bulb went off in my head. And it was a light bulb that led me to write this book, which Eric mentioned, Unwarranted Policing Without Permission. It's the subtitle that, in fact, is going to matter in just a moment. And to start this organization, the Policing Project, which is, I think, a unique organization in that we work very closely with policing agencies and with communities impacted by policing, in fact, with all stakeholders, to try to bring democratic engagement to policing. Here's the light bulb. So I'm indeed a con law guy. So this is an obvious picture for a con law guy, 3 branches of government. And what happened in 2006 was that I realized that we talk about accountability all the time around constitutional law. We talk about it around policing all the time. But that we actually mean 2 completely different things when we talk about it in policing and in all the rest of government. So in government, when I teach the regular constitutional law course, when I talk about accountability, I mean lawmaking, which is that before government officials act, we pass laws, we do it transparently, we do it with public input, and we try. I'm not going to sit here and praise the legislative process to any of you. You all know how well or poorly it works, but we try to do more good than harm. But when we talk about accountability around policing, that's not at all what we mean. We're always talking about accountability on the back end, which is to say, in the rest of government, we try to have accountability before officers act, officials act, and in policing, we're always trying to bring accountability after something happens, after something's gone wrong. So whether it's criminal actions against officers, which are rare, or civil rights actions, Department of Justice investigations, federal monitors, civilian review boards, even body cameras, we just keep layering one on top of the other, on top of the other. We are always trying to bring accountability after something has happened. And it can't surprise us very much. I mean, first of all, nobody's very satisfied with that system, but it can't surprise us very much because the way government is supposed to work is that front-end and back-end accountability are supposed to work in tandem, which is to say that the representatives of the people set out rules for what they expect to have happen. And then if those rules are violated by officials, then and only then do we have back-end accountability. The front end is necessary to hold people responsible. The back end then gives us an idea of where we need new rules. In policing, we don't do this. The police are mostly chartered to enforce the law, keep the peace, but not given specific instruction about what to do. And after that light bulb went off, I wrote my book. We started the policing project. I say we because Maria Ponomorenko, who joined me in New York to do that following her clerkship, helped start the policing project with me. And we do many things, one of which is write model legislation. Maria actually runs that part of our work, though she's now a professor at the University of Minnesota. And we are writing statutes, mostly for adoption at the state level, to try to give instruction about things around policing. For example, if I were to ask you the number of states in this country that have a comprehensive use of force policy, I'd be curious what number you would give me, but the real number is 0. There's no state in this country that has a comprehensive use of force statute, and they all should have that. Similarly with data collection and transparency, with regulation of pretextual stops, a raft of issues that if it were not the police, but were any other agency of government, we would have statutes. We have none. So that's front-end accountability. And we focused on front-end accountability for, 5 or 6 years. And along the way, I spent a lot of time in police cars, in command headquarters, in policing agencies, in community rooms, talking with members of impacted communities, black and brown communities. And along the way, I came to understand that even though I thought front-end accountability still was, and I still believe is, extremely important, that I only understood half of the problem, that I had missed entirely half of what went wrong in policing. That the problem is that we ask the police to do many, many things in the society to which they are neither trained nor suited. That was the insight which you now hear in society, and I'm going to come back to. But I had not understood that. And in fact, I worked with a group of our interns at the Policing Project, and they went and we got the training regimes for different state training agencies, different policing agencies, and we constructed a pie chart. And we saw that police spend a lot of time in the academy and in training learning to use force or not to use force. They spend a lot of time just learning to be cops, how the radio works, how protocols work. They spend a lot of time learning about the law and how to enforce the law. But very, very, very little of their training, if at all, goes to most of what they get asked to do all day long. And that is what led me to think about reimagining public safety. Now, to talk about it, I've decided to talk about the situation with people who are unhoused.
because, as was clear from some conversation we had at dinner last night, it may be the most difficult problem of the sort that I'm going to describe. So here are some numbers to just give you a sense of the scope of the problem. The Federal Housing and Urban Development Agency estimated in 2020 that there were between 500,000 and 600,000 people who were unhoused, and about 40% of those, just under 40%, were unsheltered, what sometimes we refer to as sleeping rough, meaning they have nowhere to sleep but out on the street, and live but out on the street. Here in Maricopa County in 2018, it was just over 6,000 folks, 3,000 of which were unsheltered. And in Arizona in 2020, it was about 11,000 unhoused folks, 75% of whom are sleeping rough. Now, I want to tell you two things about these numbers. The first is they're not accurate. Nobody thinks they're really accurate. What HUD tries to do is do a point-in-time count. So one evening, I think it's in January every year, they just muster armies of folks to go out and try to count how many people are homeless. And there's only so good a job you can do. So the Federal Department of Education estimates that in these same years, 1 million school kids were unhoused, a fair number of them unsheltered. And homeless advocates will argue that this number could be as high as 3.5 million people. But the other problem with this number is that it's a number. It doesn't capture in any meaningful way what it means to be unhoused, to live on the street. The vulnerability, the lack of sanitation, the health issues that come with that, the mental health problems, which are both cause and effect, substance use problems. The list goes on and on and on. And our reaction, I hope, and I sometimes think, is empathy. Feeling for these folks, trying to help. But I'm also perfectly well aware that homeless people can seem annoying, irritating, threatening, unsanitary. And so we as a society, what do? We criminalize being without a home. We have a raft of laws that we have adopted to make it illegal to be homeless. Anti-camping ordinances, vagrancy ordinances, begging and panhandling ordinances, sitting or lying down in public. And one that my wife violates constantly, which is sharing food with homeless people. She gets annoyed when I give homeless people money. She thinks we should be giving them what they need to live, and so she goes out and purchases food for people. It's illegal in plenty of places. We make it illegal to do the very things that people have no choice but to do. Now, just because you make something illegal doesn't mean that it magically happens. We all know that. So we need the police. And we use the police to roust homeless people, to move them from where they are, to arrest them, to take their possessions. And by the way, I want to emphasize the use of the word we, because there's a lot of criticism of policing right now in the United States of America. I can be critical of policing right now in the United States of America, but I am very clear, and in fact, I was very clear and very angry after George Floyd was killed, at all of the politicians pointing fingers at the police when they should have been pointing fingers at themselves, because we are the ones who are responsible and should feel responsible every day for what it is that we ask the police to do and what they do. Now, there are three things wrong, in my view, with criminalizing the homeless. The first is, it's just morally wrong. It doesn't make sense to criminalize behavior that people cannot avoid engaging in. The second problem is it doesn't work. So I'll just give you a minute to read the statistics. I don't need to read them to you. I'll take a sip of water. We just have a revolving door. You can't fix people being unhoused by being homeless by arresting them, by bringing them into the criminal law system. It won't work. And finally, it doesn't make economic sense. This one's a little more dubious. I'm interested to hear more from other people, but there are studies that show that, in fact, it is more expensive to run this revolving door with the criminal justice system, which is, in fact, extremely expensive, rather than getting people into acceptable housing and providing them with the social services that will allow some number of them to simply improve their lives. So now I want to think about, why do we do this? If it doesn't make any sense, why is this our societal approach? And here I want to talk about two things, the first of which is, what do we mean by public safety? When we talk about people being safe, and when we talk about public safety, what are we talking about? So if you go to your Google and you type in public safety and then jurisdiction of your choice, Phoenix, Minneapolis, St. Louis, this is what you get. This actually isn't what you actually get because there will be a lot of men in the picture, not women. I use this slide because at the Policing Project, we have an initiative called 30 by 30, which is trying to raise the number of women in policing to 30% by 2030. It's far lower than that. And there are plenty of studies that show that we get better policing with more women in policing. But what you get if you Google public safety is the police. Maybe EMS, maybe fire. When we think about public safety in this country, when politicians talk about public safety, they're talking about these first responders. And I have three things that I want to say about that approach. The first is, that's an insufficiently capacious understanding of what safety means. Yes, we all want to be safe from third-party harm, from people who seek to injure us, for sure. But to be safe requires a lot more than that. It requires clean water, as the people in Flint, Michigan learned. It requires food. It requires housing. It requires a way to earn a living. It requires an education to do that. It may well require transportation to get to that job. Now, you may not agree with me all the way down this list. I've talked with people about these issues, and I get a lot of pushback when I reach transportation. People say, it can't really be that transportation is part of public safety, but I'll tell you a story. 2 days after the George Floyd verdict, when Dante Wright was killed, right outside of Minneapolis proper, we ran a focus group with members of the black community in that area, in Minneapolis in particular, co-hosted by the Minneapolis Foundation. And we started to talk about what public safety involved. And the first issue that came out of everyone's mouth was transportation. Why? Because the buses weren't safe and people couldn't get to work safely. Because driver's education costed money that kids couldn't afford, and so they couldn't get licenses, and the police kept stopping them knowing they didn't have licenses, so they couldn't get to work. So we need to think more capaciously about what we mean for people to be safe. The second thing we need to do is think about government's role in all of that. In the United States, and I'll spare you the constitutional law, but I was going to talk about a case that you might have learned about in class, DeShaney versus Winnebago County. The Supreme Court has said the government doesn't have an affirmative obligation to provide public safety. It has an obligation to avoid violating our rights, our Fourth Amendment rights, our First Amendment rights, but no affirmative obligation. And I think that's wrong. I think that, in fact, the government has an obligation. The first duty of government is to ensure that people are safe, and that requires, for people who can't do it themselves, providing some basic necessities. Now, you may disagree with me about the first point and the second point, but I want to make a third, which is that public safety is two-sided. Public safety is Janus-faced. It's two-edged. If I don't feel safe, and I call the police, and the police come, then the folks that made me feel unsafe are themselves not safe. If I'm a Karen and I call the police because somebody is living while black, and the police come, that person's not safe. If I feel threatened by people who are unhoused and I call the police, then those folks aren't safe. And there's two reasons, and I'm going to come back to this in just a moment, but I want to just put them in your head now. One is because when we call the police, there's the potential for two things to go wrong. The first is the harm that just comes with policing. I remember one of the first chiefs I ever met who said, policing's not something everybody wants to watch all the time. It involves uses of force. It involves searches and seizures. There's harm attendant to policing. It's just part of the job. Every police officer knows this. And the other is because when we call the police to address problems that they can't solve, we leave those problems unsolved. So then you might think, well, why do we do this? Why don't we have a better approach? So the second thing I want to mention is, and I realize there are a lot of 2s and 3s going on here, but I hope you're following along. We don't use cost-benefit analysis around public safety. So what's cost-benefit analysis? You all know, you use it all day long. All the decisions you make, you do this rough weighing in your head of, what are the advantages, what are the disadvantages? Sometimes you maybe took a piece of paper and drew a line down the middle when you were trying to make a hard life decision, and you wrote all the advantages on one side and the disadvantages on the other. That's cost-benefit analysis. And we use cost-benefit analysis as a regulatory tool all over government. Environmental law, workplace safety, financial regulation. It's just a tool that we use to figure out what regulation should look like. But we don't use it around public safety. I was astonished to learn this when I was writing my book. I sent my research assistants to the library to say, get me some cost-benefit studies on stop and frisk, or I don't know, whatever's your vehicle pursuits, name it. And I didn't believe it when they came back and told me that they didn't exist, until I went and looked for myself. Now, I know there are criminologists in the audience, and you're probably disagreeing with me right now, and you're thinking, no, that's what we do. We study policing in just this way. You do and you don't. So it is true that we often look, though not nearly as much as we should, at the efficacy of what the police do. Is what the police doing, does it work? We look to see if it works. That's the benefit side. And I'll point out, by the way, that we often don't even do that. So one of my particular interests, because I'm a con law guy, is surveillance. And whether it's license plate readers or facial recognition or stingrays, or I could go down the list, we just actually don't ask if any of that stuff works. We just do it. But even if we ask if it works, and by the way, you should never not ask if it works, because if there are no provable benefits, we just shouldn't entertain the costs. But if you do the benefit side, you have to do the cost side. Now, we do some cost. We ask, what does a cop cost? What does a prison bed cost? Hard costs, you can call those. But what we don't do is look at the social costs of policing. What are the costs incurred by the people who are policed? What is the value that we should put on being coerced by the state? What is the value that we should put on being searched? What is the value that we should put on having one's goods seized? Ben McJunkin, in a different paper than the one he's going to talk about here, wrote something that I don't know why it was this thing that just grabbed me so much. But he was talking about police and police taking apart housing camps for the folks who are unhoused, and about seizing possessions. And one thing he talked about was a woman who lost in one of those seizures the Purple Heart that her daughter had earned in service to this country. And for some reason, that just grabbed me. Those are social costs, and we don't count them. And what I want to suggest is that if we did count them, we wouldn't approach issues the way that we do. And the point that I want to make is, if a badge and a gun isn't going to solve the problem, we should be thinking about trying to solve it another way. And I want to say, there are plenty of cops who agree with this, who, if you talk about them, will say, we get asked to do all kinds of things all day long that we're not trained to do, we're not the right people to do it. It just gets dumped on us by society. Now, again, if I had come to talk to you about this in 2019, I'm reasonably confident some of what I was saying wouldn't make any sense. But now it does. People are talking about it. All of a sudden, you hear people talking about alternative responses to social problems. And the one you hear about the most is mental health issues and substance issues. But I have 3 things I want to say about that. So the first is, it's wildly underambitious to just think about that issue. There are lots of things that the police get asked to do all day long that there's at least a reasonable question whether a badge and a gun is what's needed. Some folks are starting to talk about traffic enforcement, about which I could talk for a very long time, but mostly not. We leave it to the police. Noise complaints. Are police the right folks to show up for those? Domestic disagreements. Maybe, maybe not. Burglar alarms. It turns out the police spend a lot of time answering false alarms. Animal control issues. I could go on and on and on with a list of things that we ask the police to do. In fact, sometimes when I do this lecture, I show you data from outside of Cincinnati, and you look at how police respond in their 911 calls, and you have to go pretty far down that list to get to something that you would think of as crime. And so we're underambitious to just look at mental health and substance use. The second thing is, say you want to do this. Now you want to reimagine public safety. You want to tackle this set of issues. How do we do it? Well, it turns out there's a limited number of choices. One is we have police response. And with police response, as I've pointed out, there's both the harm that comes with police response, but there's also the fact that we're not solving the problems. You'll often hear from cops, and data shows that they'll get called to the same address 10 times in 3 months. It's because we're not fixing the problem. So maybe we should have somebody other than the police respond, social workers or psychologists, I don't know. But then the problem with that is sometimes you get called to things go bad. You need the coercive authority of the state. You may need force. In fact, there are plenty of alternative responders who don't want to show up unless the police are there. And so then the other answer is co-response. Now, these are the models people are talking about right now, but I came to realize that they have a problem also. And it's one of expense and logistics. So think about this. Suppose we go back to this list, and you think, this is fair, Friedman. Here's what we're going to do. We're just going to set up responders for all these different things. We'll have traffic responders, and we'll have people that deal with noise complaints and animal issues. I personally think, burglar alarms, ADT, and all those companies should have their own little cars that drive around and check out their false alarms. But so we're going to have all these responders. Or you could think about it a different way, which is instead of responders to these kinds of issues, you could think about, what are the skills you need? We could have mediators to deal with issues on the street where people can't work out their difficulties, which sometimes turn violent. We could have social workers who deal with problems like folks who are unhoused. We could have psychologists who could diagnose what's going on in the world. We could have basic EMS. We could just have a raft of different skills. But then think about it. A call comes into a 911 center. Who do they send? How many people do they send? It's a logistical nightmare, and it's going to be extremely expensive. And so the question is there something else we could do? Now I introduce you to my fantasy. So when I first started to think about this problem and to reimagine public safety and to ask what we could do to get better outcomes for society, because that should be our goal from a cost-benefit perspective, which is to optimize the government's response to people in need, I thought the trick was specialization. The problem is we ask cops to be kind of one-size-fits-all responders. And it's unfair to ask that. They're not trained to do it. So we need to specialize. We need people who can deal with all these things. And then I saw the problem, and what I realized was society is always, always, always going to need first responders. And first responders are going to have to be generalists because you just can't send all these different people. We can't afford it, and you can't organize it. And I tried to think of a model. And the model I thought of was emergency room doctors. So think about the emergency room, an experience that I'm guessing most of us have had at one point in our lives or another. You go to the emergency room, and you meet a doctor who is a specialist generalist. They're trained in emergency medicine, but they're generalists. They handle lots of different medical specialties, and they have 3 jobs: to stabilize the emergency, to get it under control, to fix whatever it is they can fix, and then if not, to get you to a specialist who over the long haul can fix the problem in an enduring way. And my fantasy is that we actually create a new form of first response that's like emergency room doctors. Holistically trained people who learn all of the specialties that are needed, the mediation and the social work, the social services, the psychological evaluation, the EMS. Maybe they go to 4-year programs, learn some humanities and social sciences as well. Somebody suggested to me that it should be like ROTC, where we, in fact, help pay the tuition for folks who can't afford it, and then they owe back a certain number of years as first responders. And in my world, their motto is here to help. We're here to help solve your problem. Now, there's one last question. It's a super hard question. I don't know the answer, but I'm going to give it to you, and then I'm going to sit down and let other people smarter than I am grapple with this. So that question is, if my dream happened, if we created a whole new form of first response, a holistic form of first response, designed to actually help people deal with problems. And by the way, I should have said, one of the most important things about these responders is that they would have the authority to compel government to provide the follow-on services like emergency room doctors to actually solve the underlying problems. The question is, do you also train them in the use of force and law enforcement? Or do you keep that separate? And there are strong arguments on both sides. On the one hand, if you keep them together, you might end up, some people say to me, just like the police all over again. I don't know that that's true. And in fact, I will confess, my inclination is to think that you have to do that holistically. Some folks say, no, you got to keep them separate. We don't want the first responders to be police. But then you've created just the police, like a unit just for force and law. I'm not sure that's the right answer. I don't know the answer to that question. I'm hoping at the Policing Project it's something we can tackle. We are thinking about it every day, as we are all the rest of this reimagining public safety. But for now, I want to thank you, and I get to sit down and listen.
Thank you so much, Professor Friedman. We are fortunate to be joined by 4 cutting-edge scholars who will provide commentary as well as diverse perspectives and different angles on the issues that Professor Friedman so eloquently touched upon. So let me briefly give you their backgrounds, seriatim, one after another, and then we'll have each of them speak for about 5 to 10 minutes or so. First is Trevor Gardner, a professor of law at Washington University School of Law in St. Louis, Missouri. He is one of the leading voices on federalism and police administration, and has been an important contributor to a new literature of African-American perspectives on police reform. You can find his scholarship throughout the leading journals, including the Stanford Law Review, the Yale Law Journal, and the Columbia Law Review. Second is Maria Ponomorenko. She is an associate professor of law at the University of Minnesota Law School. She is one of the leading scholars on the intersection between administrative law and agency issues and policing, which of course is an agency. She is a co-founder and counsel at the Policing Project, which Barry is the leader of, as well as an associate reporter for the American Law Institute's Principles of Policing. Third is Brandon Del Pozo. Professor Del Pozo, 19 years in the NYPD, an actual police officer, and as a chief of police in Burlington, Vermont. He is currently a postdoctoral researcher at Rhode Island's Miriam Hospital and the Warren Alpert Medical School at Brown University, and his work includes the important intersection between policing and public health. And last but certainly not least is my colleague Ben McJunkin, Associate Professor of Law here at the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law and the Associate Director for the Academy for Justice. He is one of the leading scholars on the protection of privacy, particularly in spheres that are ostensibly public. He also, more than any other faculty member, and don't let anybody say this otherwise, is responsible for making this event possible today. Without further ado, let me call up our first commentator, Professor Trevor Gardner.
So it's good to be with you. I want to start out by thanking Professor McJunkin for the gracious invitation. Also want to thank the Academy for Justice for organizing the event. And then I'd like to just offer a special thanks to Barry Friedman for a couple different reasons. I'm deeply appreciative of Barry's work on police reform. I think it's important to emphasize that Barry is actually in the trenches in a way that's heartening and inspiring. I think it takes courage not only to advance a project like the policing project, but it also takes courage to take on an issue such as the policing of the homeless, which we'll learn over the next several minutes over the course of the various comments that it's an issue that people struggle with and have for some time. So I want to turn for a moment to Professor Friedman's paper, and I want to draw out some of the features of the paper that I really appreciated. First of all, I think it's of critical importance to illuminate the experience of the unhoused. And so the paper itself, among other things, sketches the web of criminal liability that unhoused individuals encounter, given the various slate of laws that in effect criminalize homelessness. So Professor Friedman also conveys that police are in many ways, as he mentioned just a moment ago, ill-suited in many circumstances to manage the unhoused population, given this population's acute need for various public services outside of policing, including mental health services. Finally, just to briefly address the solutions, I admire Professor Friedman's solutions, the normative solutions offered, in part because they're pragmatic, and they're pragmatic in a way that differs from my presentation. My presentation is going to be relatively abstract, and it's a presentation that I think is important because it addresses some of the cultural issues underpinning both the policing of the homeless and the criminal laws that are sort of predicate to that policing. But I do want to say that it's very important to offer up pragmatic solutions along the lines of sort of reformulating our first responder teams, advancing cost-benefit analysis. These are immediate solutions that we need now because the problem is an acute one. So let me turn to my thesis, along with the central question that Professor Friedman presents: are police the key to public safety? Again, are police the key to public safety? And my answer to that question is, it depends. And I know you're thinking at this point, Gardner, thanks a lot, that's tremendous help. It depends, thanks for your contribution. Depends on what exactly? In my view, it depends in significant part on our culture, our ideology, and both of these things as they relate to economic policy. And so we know, I don't think this is up for dispute, we know that our culture informs our values inform our politics, and our politics inform our laws. So let me turn at this point to my specific point. And it's, the point is essentially that it's not clear to me that policing policy as it relates to the unhoused and poor people in general, that policy has arisen largely outside of the democratic process, outside of public awareness. My sense instead is that the policing of poor people, and this is nationwide, that it's formulated not sort of on an island away from society, away from the democratic process, but it's instead steeped in our public culture, our public values, and our politics, right? So I think as a general matter, society has a fair sense of the social costs that accumulate in policing the poor. So in this sense, I want to push back just a bit on what I'll call, for purposes of my argument, the apathy thesis. This notion that the policing of the poor is in large part a function of the public's ignorance, as opposed to a function of conscious choices made by our elected representatives regarding what I'll call poverty governance. So if we take the case of the unhoused, right, we need to look specifically at the slate of municipal ordinances targeting the unhoused, which Professor Friedman lays out in his paper and as he articulated just a moment ago. And I'll repeat them just briefly. For thinking about camping ordinances relating to putting up tents in public spaces. We think about loitering, begging, vagrancy, urinating in public. You know, these are crimes that are enforced by police, but they're based on criminal ordinances that are passed by city councils. City councils are made up of city council members. City council members are elected by members of the public, city residents. And so My sense is that the story of the criminalization of homelessness is not, I don't think, a story that's unfolded in some dark corner of society. I think it's not a story that's unfolded sort of worlds away from the influence of democratic politics. Now, Barry notes in his paper that 3 of our, let's say, most open-minded, bleeding heart cities, Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, they've enacted laws that broadly criminalize the condition of being unhoused. I want to offer at this point just a couple comments, a couple points rather, with respect to these laws that I'm talking about that criminalize homelessness. And I don't want to, I offer these comments in part because I think it's important to disaggregate the criminalization of homelessness, and I'll do so in this specific way. I want to draw a distinction between what I'll call for the moment bad faith criminalization of the unhoused population and good faith criminal enforcement as it relates to the unhoused. And I think this is an important distinction. If we're talking about bad faith criminalization, I think at that point we're talking about, in part, the philosophy underlying the criminal justice system itself, right? So we have this system that, at least theoretically, is meant to ensure public safety. It's also meant to, we learn in criminal law, to express the moral outrage of the community, right? But if we talk about these ordinances, again, these ordinances that seem to criminalize homelessness itself, I don't think many of these ordinances speak directly to either of those objectives, right? So we're talking at this point about quality of life crimes, specific misdemeanor crimes of the quality I mentioned just a moment ago. And there's a historian at Rutgers by the name of Kristen Oberzeal-Kaufman. She calls this form of criminalization the criminalization of subsistence activities that impoverish our fellow citizens, that criminalize our impoverished fellow citizens. So again, I'm trying to make a distinction here in the criminalization conversation between this particular form of criminalization and criminal enforcement and what we might understand to be common law crimes, more conventional crimes along the lines of robbery, burglary, murder, kidnapping, rape. Let me turn for a moment to talk about good faith efforts by society to achieve public safety among the unhoused. Here we're talking less about the ordinances that criminalize poverty. We're putting these aside momentarily to talk about the policing of these, more conventional crimes among individuals who are subject to unspeakable deprivation, considerable stress, an unstable social environment. And I would imagine that police have an important role in managing large groups that are sort of subject to these circumstances. And here I just want to offer, by way of analogy, a note from Lawrence Friedman's book, Crime and Punishment in American History. Among other things in this book, Friedman lays out the notion that the vagrancy laws not only arose in the 19th century, they arose as a function of increased mobility in our society. And so here we're talking about the introduction of the vehicle, the automobile, travel from town to town. People traveling from town to town because they were jobless, they were looking for stability. Vagrancy laws sort of arose in this context, and I'll move forward and finish in just a minute or two. He makes the point that vagrancy laws arose not only targeting this more mobile population, a population that brought a certain degree of instability to communities, to towns, et cetera, but also in relation to slaves that were essentially fugitives, people who had escaped slavery, had come north, and were sort of looked at unfavorably by the societies, the communities that they entered. So in any event, this was an attempt to manage a new social dynamic. And what I want to sort of talk about at this point is the complexity of social dynamics and how, certain social dynamics, and how those complexities give rise to new forms of policing. What's my point exactly? My point is that the unhoused community is a very complex community, a community that is obviously on the social margins, and a community that has to wrestle with any number of risks and threats as they relate to criminal offending. So let me advance to my point and try to close. I don't want to take too much time. My point is essentially this, that we think about, when we think about the homeless and the policing of the homeless, we think about the quality of policing that happens on the ground. But I think we should be thinking a little bit more about our economic culture and our economic ideology, the social circumstances that flow from our economic policy, and how policing and criminalization is a response to that economic policy, to our economic forms of organization, our economic culture, our economic values. So I'm talking here principally about free market fundamentalism, the notion that we should prioritize low taxes, that we should prioritize a relatively small government, that we should prioritize a relatively small welfare state in the interest of societal flourishing. I think this gets to the heart of the matter, because if we're talking specifically about reformulating first responder teams, if we're talking about each time the police engage with a person who is in desperate need of help, is in need of rescue, given their circumstance of being unhoused, we're going to have to connect them to, I would argue, a menu of public services that aren't currently available. And we're not just talking about one person, right? We're talking about a broad criminalization of the homeless, and therefore every time a police officer encounters a homeless person, I think we would expect the police officer to be able to convey these public services. What does that mean from a cost standpoint? What does that mean from an economic standpoint? I think that's the fundamental question we have to ask, that's an upstream question, an upstream issue that obviously flows downstream and speaks to what we need from police in terms of their interaction with the unhoused, what they're capable of doing in terms of their engagement with the unhoused. So I'll end there. I'm at time. I had a few more comments that maybe I can squeeze in the context of Q&A, but let me just leave you with this point. Policing is very important. I'm thankful that we have so many members of law enforcement here with us today. I think their jobs are difficult. Obviously there are any number of challenges that we have with respect to the quality of policing, but I think we need to sort of take a few steps back on occasion, contextualize policing in terms of our larger economic circumstances, our economic philosophy, and our economic values, and ask the question of how policing flows from those particular circumstances. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, everyone. So first, thank you for being here and taking time out of your days, especially those of you, if there are anyone else in the room, I know just how stressful the 1L year is, so if you're here, you're winning already. I also just want to really thank the folks at the Academy for Justice, especially Ben, who's just done a tremendous job pulling this event together, and then just want to second Trevor's note of thanks to Barry Friedman as well. So as he's mentioned, he brought me on to help start the policing project at NYU, now 6 years ago. Time has flown really fast in the pandemic, but before we started the policing project, I was definitely on the road to becoming a law professor who thought that the way we regulate policing is through the lens of constitutional criminal procedure. And it was the time that I spent at the policing project and working with Barry in both our scholarship and the practical work in departments, including with some of the folks in this room. I spent a lot of time in Tucson, so it's really nice to see the Tucson contingent here. But it was the time on the ground that really got me to see policing as a governance issue and as an issue that's really tied into municipal government, our federal structure, in ways that I just would never have seen. So Barry, thank you for all of that, and it's great to finally see you in person again. So the focus of my remarks is on our fragmented federal system and the ways in which it makes it really, really difficult to pursue a sound approach when it comes to addressing the needs of the unhoused. And I'll say at the end, this actually has much broader implications for any sort of broader effort to reimagine public safety. So what do I mean by fragmented? So, you've all kind of done Civics 101, we have municipal, county, state governments, federal government, when it comes to social services, the way in which we allocate responsibility across those units is incredibly both fragmented and that it's spread out across those, and it also overlaps in a variety of ways. So first, if you take something like public health, so counties deliver a lot of public health services, which are funded by state and federal governments. Education is provided by entirely separate municipal units. So I love giving this talk in Phoenix because you guys have 31 school districts that overlap with Phoenix borders. So you have 31 different decision makers that are deciding how education in just this one city takes place. There are also, 30-ish municipalities within the county that are each making decisions about their own police departments, their own services, how they're going to respond to social problems in ways that spill over across state lines. And so when you look at our societal approach to the problems of the unhoused, we often say, here's how we respond to the problem, but the we is actually mediated through dozens, hundreds, thousands of different decision makers across various agencies and levels of government. And what we get is the really imperfect product of every one of these individual decisions. So what's the implication of that? So, Barry kind of points to this paradox. So there's been lots of studies that have suggested that we spend a lot of money on the kind of status quo, which tends to be on the more punitive side. We spend a lot of money to cycle unhoused individuals through jails, through hospitals, or to leave them unsheltered on the street. And then there's lots of evidence to suggest that government as a whole can actually save money by investing in housing and supportive services. Now, as Barry mentions, the studies have their limitations. I've spent a lot of time now with the studies and can confirm that, there's some assumptions that are baked in that are probably a little bit unrealistic. Some of the most rigorous studies have suggested it's probably a wash or maybe slightly more expensive to provide housing. But the paradox remains, which is that we could solve a problem for as much, if not just a tiny bit more money than we're currently spending to leave the problem unsolved, and in doing so generating these really, really tremendous social harms. Now, one thing you might be sitting here, and this was kind of the focus about Professor Gardner's remarks, is maybe it's actually not such a paradox at all. So we're pretty stingy as a society. We have a very sparse social safety net. We tend to assign moral blame to individuals for what are really structural failings. And so maybe it's not that surprising that we often rely on policing and the criminal law to deal with individuals who we maybe sometimes have trouble empathizing with or would just prefer not to see around. It also may not be a paradox in that, governments don't do a good job of figuring out whether what they're doing works, not just in public safety. So, Professor Friedman tells us that we don't do cost-benefit analysis around public safety. The reality is we don't actually do a lot of public, cost-benefit analysis around state and local government and service provision generally. We don't track lots of data. People touch the system at different points, and there's not a lot of overlap. And so maybe local governments just don't know that they're behaving irrationally. What I want to suggest is actually the fragmentation of our system means that even if everybody was doing their kind of utmost best, we were tracking all the data, we had all the information, no particular government unit might actually have the incentive, at least the financial incentive, to address the problem in a way that moves us away from the punitive status quo. And here I'm going to throw some numbers at you and kind of get into the nitty-gritty of budgets, which may seem a little bit dry, but are hugely important. As my students will tell you, dry but important is kind of a subspecialty of mine. So what are the costs of kind of the homelessness problem or kind of addressing the needs of the unhoused? So most of the studies that have looked at the kind of costs of homelessness have looked at 3 buckets of costs. So there's criminal system costs, which is to say the cost of sending a police officer, the cost of an arrest, the cost of housing somebody in jail if they're incarcerated, the court costs and fees, all of that. So those are the criminal system costs. Then there's the medical costs. So, as Professor Friedman mentioned, individuals who are unsheltered in particular tend to incur really huge medical system costs. They're relying primarily on emergency services, so long-term needs are going unmet. But then in moments of crisis, they land in hospitals, they land in healthcare facilities, they land in substance abuse facilities, and these costs can be really tremendous. And then finally, there's the cost of housing itself. And the conventional wisdom is that jurisdictions could invest more in housing, thereby saving on both criminal system costs and medical costs. So if we get somebody housing and supportive services, we get them stable, kind of long-term maintenance care, that's cheaper than sending the police or emergency medical services on kind of an ad hoc basis. But here it's useful to think about who bears those various costs. And so when it comes to criminal system costs, those are actually the costs that are borne primarily by the city. So in my paper, I look specifically at Phoenix, and here most of the criminal system costs are going to be borne by the city itself. So the city pays for the police. The city also, under its agreements with the county, pays for incarceration, at least for low-level offenses. The city doesn't capture all of the criminal system costs. So there's a professor by the name of Frank Simmering who coined this term the correctional free lunch. And the idea is that states pay for prisons, counties pick up some of the costs for jail, it depends on kind of the agreements, but cities are the ones who make the decision to arrest, and it's usually county prosecutors who decide whether to charge. And what it basically means is that cities and counties can pursue tough on crime policies and offload those costs onto the state. You see a little bit of that here, but actually a lot less, which is to say for the low-level offenses that tend to bring unhoused individuals into the criminal system, those largely fall to the city, and those are costs the city could maybe save. The problem is those costs in the grand scheme of things are actually not that substantial. So most estimates suggest it's something in the realm of $4,000 or $5,000 per unsheltered person per year. It's a lot of money to save. But as we look at the magnitude of all of the other costs, it gets largely dwarfed. So then we have healthcare costs. So healthcare is paid, especially healthcare for the indigent, is paid for by states and the federal government. And when it comes to the needs of the unhoused, the healthcare costs are the biggest pile. So some estimates have suggested that government as a whole spends $20,000, $30,000 a year per person who is chronically unsheltered on emergency medical services. And so when we're looking at what costs are the kind of easiest to reduce by stabilizing somebody, it's the medical system costs. But notice now, those costs are not the costs that would accrue back to the city, right? So if the city invests in housing, the savings are going to accrue to the state and federal governments, who through the Medicaid system are the ones who are actually paying for indigent care. And then finally, we have housing itself. And it takes a little while to figure out exactly who pays for housing. The federal government pays for virtually all both emergency housing and subsidized housing in the city of Phoenix. So Phoenix, out of its own budget, pays very little for housing, but that federal budget is capped. So the federal government won't give the city of Phoenix more money if Phoenix wants to do more. And so if we think about a city like Phoenix deciding to invest more money in housing, more money in shelters, more money in supportive services, the city would end up bearing all of those costs. So let's put all those together. So if you're a city like Phoenix and you're looking at what your options are, you could save a little bit on criminal system costs. You would have to invest quite a bit in housing and supportive services, and then the biggest savings that would accrue would not be to the city itself, but rather to the state and federal government that would see dramatic reductions in medical system costs. And so what we have is a structure where, for any particular unit of government, if they're looking at their own budget books and at least trying to think about how do we pursue kind of cost benefit or cost efficient policy, no one really has the incentive to move toward the more holistic, care-focused model that Professor Friedman proposes. So that's the unhoused. Now, I'm going to just say a word about the kind of implications for imagining public safety more broadly, and in doing so, kind of pick up on a lot of the themes in Professor Gardner's talk. as well. So, we've had a lot of conversation about defunding policing, about reimagining public safety, and there's this notion that if we just take some money away from the criminal system and reallocate it elsewhere, that we could address problems in better ways. How we've seen this actually play out in individual cities, even ones that have tried to make pretty significant changes, always seems really small, which is to say, small investments in co-response, small investments in community response programs and juvenile programs, youth services, and so forth. And the reason why those efforts feel small is because cities are responsible for so little of the broader social safety net, right? So if you're a city like Phoenix that's really committed, say, to having a more holistic response to public safety, to addressing people's needs before they end up in the criminal system, well, you have independent school districts that are deciding how school is funded and how school services are delivered, how students are disciplined in school or how they're trained. You have the county that's actually responsible for delivering health services, substance abuse treatment. You have the state that's allocating funding for a lot of these services. You have the federal government that's been shrinking federal housing for years and years and years, right up until the latest pandemic when there was finally an infusion of funds. And so when we think about this broader project of reimagining public safety, the note I want to close on is just to realize that cities aren't really the place to focus. Cities can do some of this, but the reality is what we need to be paying attention to is who's not just kind of making the decisions on the ground, but who's paying for them, how these responsibilities are allocated, and really be thinking about what it would take on a much broader level, those shift incentives and responsibilities in ways that could get us to a kind of less punitive, more holistic status quo. And with that, I will turn it over to Brandon, but thank you all.
So hey, my name is Brandon Del Pozo. It's wonderful to be here. It's just great to be in person with folks. I'd like to thank ASU for putting this together, Barry for writing something that merited a distinguished lecture that catalyzed this, and just to be here with this audience of wonderful people. There's some cops I've worked with as a former cop, scholars I've worked with as a scholar, so this is a great event. Just for the record, so I commanded the 6th precinct in the NYPD, which is the home to NYU Law School. So Barry and I had a match made in heaven or hell, where you have this precinct commander studying political philosophy, and then an attorney trying to reform policing. And I don't know, does anyone know that the scholar, legal scholar Ronald Dworkin? He passed recently, but I was driving around in the field one day, and the 1011, a burglar alarm came over. So we're receiving a burglar alarm in Washington Mews at the Ronald Dworkin residence. And I said, I'll take it, Central. And I thought I was going to get this these ad hoc office hours where I'd press it on some of his jurisprudence, but it was his housekeeper that set the alarm off. So I just left a note for him. But anyway, I say that to say, as a prelude, I study policing and public health right now. I study addiction at the Medical School at Brown and Brown's Teaching Hospital. One of my efforts is operationalizing the alignment between policing and public health. I think that the danger we're at, and I was just saying this to Maria, is public health has been used as an unfilled promissory note for police reform, especially since the murder of George Floyd. When you looked at the Minneapolis referendum, it said replace policing with a holistic public health approach, basically. But cashing that out, I think, has gone unarticulated. And so on the pro side, you have people making this promise, saying just trust us, replace policing with public health, it'll all work out. And then on the negative side, you have people saying this is just an undefined buzzword that's going to put us all in danger. They don't even know what they're talking about. But I think there is tremendous promise in aligning, and when you think about homelessness, aligning improved health outcomes, not only at the individual level of the homeless person, but at the community and population level, with public safety. I think when we talk a lot about what public safety means, and we get past measures like the number of kilos we seize, the number of guns we take off the street, the number of arrests we make, we are talking about better health outcomes. We're talking about communities with less violence, fewer shootings, fewer stabbings, fewer homicides, Drug enforcement, at least, although it fails, aspires to reduce the number of fatal and non-fatal overdoses, which is a distinct health outcome. Traffic enforcement has been misapplied in all sorts of ways, but at least strives in its purest form to increase roadway safety, which is a big form of injury and accident in the nation. So I think there's a lot of promise there, but in the remaining like 6 minutes I have, I guess, I'd like to take one step further back and say I got into that line of research to operationalize like my PhD's in political philosophy. So what do you do with that? Apparently you leave it and go into public health. But I worked out a basic working theory of what the police owe to the democratic state and what the democratic state should be using the police for. And part of it has implications for this question of homelessness. So one of the things I think we all agree on is the police have at least some role in protecting and rescuing people from imminent physical harms, right? And it's not this unique role to the police. The fire department does it, EMS does it, emergency room doctors have a role in it. But as far as physical violence goes and a lot of other like proximate threats, it's the police that we expect, or somebody like the police with the power to physically disassemble and stop a situation to protect and rescue us from danger, right? A lot of police reform is a promissory note that if we get it right, we have all these upstream preventive interventions that stop these downstream situations from developing. But to the extent that they will develop, we rely on people like the police to intervene. What I will say as a curious side note is that I think all of us actually have the power to intervene to protect and rescue others. If you guys screwed it up by coming today, if there weren't cops in the audience, I'd say if there was like a person being beaten by a gang of aggressors, like anybody non-police in the audience could get up and physically rip those. We'd expect you guys to jump in and do it. We'll just stare at you, do something. But the point is, all of us can intervene to protect somebody from aggression or harm or danger. The difference is I or you, not you, but you, might have the ability to say that person's armed, they're big, I lose, like I can't do it without putting myself in great danger, I just can't do it this time. I'll get help, but I'll stand back. For the government, for the officer, it's a duty. The police officer embodies the government's promise to intervene and exercise a power that all of us actually have the ability to exercise, which is to rescue other citizens from harm. If you wonder where that comes from, it comes right back to Locke in his Second Treatise of Government. He lays it out there. It's not just something I made up today. The second power of the police is to bring evidence and people to the magistrate when the police perceive they have probable cause to think that a law's been broken. One of the ways to think of statutes, and a lot are statutes and describe behaviors that the government has an interest in getting involved in, whether to regulate or to punish or whatever you think the role is. But the government is a brain in a vat unless its agents are out there observing what's going on, detecting the evidence, detecting the people, bringing them in. What I'll say, like very patently, before I go on to what I think is the most interesting power for today's talk, is what you guys, the lawyers, do with them is up to you. We'll bring them to you, and it seems like what you've been doing is just plea bargaining them and sending them back, finding them, plea bargaining them, and sending them to jail and kicking them back out on the street. So I'm looking at men and women who I know. Is that Chief Hall over there? Right? Chief Hall is engaged in a program which is an alternative to arrest for people who are addicted to opioids, right? Yeah, he's nodding. So what it is instead of even bringing somebody to the judge or bringing somebody to the court system, he's saying that person doesn't even go there. Instead, they go right into treatment for opioid use disorder. I think that's wonderful, but it is a signal that, like, a lot of times we've been saying, listen, the government clearly has an interest in regulating this behavior. It's a dangerous behavior. Have at it. Here you go. And the government said, hey, you owe me $1,000 and plea bargain to a misdemeanor and get out of here. Part of police reform is relying on the police to bring to attention of the government behavior that we do want to regulate, but not doing it in like the really ungainly way in which it's been happening. And one of the alternatives is just to do an end run around the whole idea of the criminal justice system and take that police authority and channel it towards medical and public health interventions like treatment. And what's unique about the Tucson program, which I admire, is it's not participation in Chief Hall and Chief Magnus's program is not contingent on you'll only get the break if you comply. You're just not going to see the judge. You're not going to see the defense attorney. They're not even involved. And if you leave treatment a few hours later and go back on the street, that's okay. That's better than nothing, but it's a meaningful alternative, right? So we might want to rethink like this whole idea of why the police bring people and evidence to your attention. Like, what are you doing with the people we're bringing you? But then the third thing, and I think this is important, is the police have this role in brokering and enforcing what I call the fair terms of social cooperation in public spaces. And I think when we're talking about homeless behavior, we're talking about types of behavior that were it not committed under involuntary circumstances and under circumstances of duress, the government has a legitimate interest in regulating the types of behavior that homelessness consists of. The problem is the category error of saying, when we see homeless people engaging in these behavior, like we have this extra strong reason to not only enforce these laws in a punitive way, but then they also do things which Barry brought up, which are really disturbing, like you can't feed them, you can't aid them, you can't give them water, food. Take all of those terrible laws and bracket them off. I'm talking about the regulation of the collective use of public space, right? If there was if Ben McJunkin set up a tent right outside, because it's always this nice out, right? In Phoenix, so he says, I want to be outside 24/7 right by the law school. I love the natural light. I love my convenient commute. I get to see my students all the time. I'm just living here. I have a nice tent set up. I think even the most sympathetic reformers would team up with the police and getting Ben, out of the courtyard there. One of the reasons why is because it seems to be voluntary, right? What he's doing, but also because it's a very uncooperative use of public space. And if you think of cities with a much denser foot traffic, like Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, Boston, I'm a Northeastern folks, sorry. You get these circumstances, and in Washington Square Park, which is Barry's office looks over the park, right? It's the epicenter of every New Yorker's dream. Sex and the City was filmed there. Every kid who goes to NYU wants to smoke a joint in the park. The homeless people want to sell them the marijuana. I was the commander of this precinct. It's this thriving area where everybody's got a collective view of the good, and they're not all compatible all the time, 24/367, 24/7, 365. So what you're getting, I think, with homelessness, it's not. I've heard a lot of the talks here characterize this in a very binary way. Either we criminalize homelessness or we don't. Either we punish the homeless or we don't. Either it's right or it's wrong. What I urge folks to think of is that there is this legitimate reason for regulating this behavior, but here's where I get non-lawyerly, but try to be a lawyer. There are reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions to this type of behavior, right? So what we get instead, and I know I'm at time, so I want to just kind of sum this up as eloquently as I can in like a minute, is we use the power of the police to take a very illiberal and populist approach to homelessness, where I don't want to see the people, I don't like the way they look, I don't like what they're doing to my property values. So use these laws like disorderly conduct and camping and all of that to just get the homeless out of my face. I don't want to deal with that, right? That's a gross misappropriation of the law. That's why we're in the mess we're in now. However, we do have an interest in making sure that if one of us wants to use the space for reading a book, someone else for frisbee, someone else for playing an instrument, someone else at the right time for having a concert, that no one, including the homeless, don't consistently dominate that space, right? That there's got to be a way for equitable and shared use of the space. And if the police are looking for the homeless in every corner of every forest and every park and rousing them wherever they see them, that's wrong. But there's got to be a sensibility that allows us to situate homeless behaviors within the larger scheme of collective behavior in public spaces and make a fair, pluralist compromise of who gets to use what spaces, when, where, and for what. And that, I think, is one of the challenges of contemporary policing. So thank you. Sorry I went a little bit over in time, but Ben.
All right. Well, let me start off by saying thank you, Barry Friedman, for being here. We're really thrilled to have you. Thank you to all the commentators for your excellent commentary. I'll try to keep it short, otherwise students know that I never shut up. So what I would say is my background, like Grant mentioned, is in legal and political philosophy. So it's probably no surprise that the part of Barry's lecture that gives me the most interest is actually his philosophical commitments that animate much of his work. Right? On the one hand, Barry Friedman comes to us and says we should rethink public safety. And I think that his more capacious conception of public safety has two key philosophical insights to it, with which I'm particularly enamored. On the other hand, he says we should reconsider our approach to policing. And here he makes a couple of legal arguments, one in the paper, one he made here today, that give me some pause. And in fact, that I think might be in tension with his deeper philosophies. So I'm going to start by explaining why Friedman's work actually reminds me of two political philosophers whose primary work is in the area of human dignity. And then I'll revisit two legal cases, Martin versus City of Boise, and Shaney versus Winnebago County, to talk about why I think that Barry Friedman might be missing the mark with his legal approach to both those cases. So let's start with philosophy, right? Barry says the reason that we task police with addressing homelessness is that we fail to appreciate both what public safety means and who must be made safe. So what does public safety mean? Right? Early Enlightenment thinkers told us that public safety is the first job of government. It's the most important thing that they could do. It's why we have government at all, right? But that concept of public safety was limited. It was likely limited to physical safety from other people, from third-party harms, maybe possession of property, something like that. Friedman calls for us to reimagine the concept of public safety in a much more capacious way. He tells us that public safety means things like food, clean water, jobs, housing, transportation. Right? So to be made safe, in the Barry Friedman sense, right, is to have the ability to have a life that's worth living. And when I hear this, right, I immediately think of a political philosopher who spent her entire career saying that the first job of government is to guarantee certain basic human capabilities for everyone on Earth. Right? And that philosopher is Martin Nussbaum. Now instead of touching this as a theory of public safety, Nussbaum says this is a theory of essential human dignity. And I think there's some clear overlap between what Barry's calling for here, right, and what Nussbaum is saying. But I also think there's some value for Barry in more explicitly embracing theories like Nussbaum's. Because the theory of human dignity also tells us which things are essential to human flourishing. Right? So the list of what items should be guaranteed to you is informed by human dignity, not necessarily by public safety. The second thing that Friedman tells us, right, is that we fundamentally misunderstand who must be made safe. Now he does this in the context of cost-benefit analysis, but I'm breaking this down a little bit because I think this is one of the most interesting insights of the lecture. Right? Policing as a practice necessarily entails a choice about how we distribute safety. If I call the police on a homeless person, I'm made more safe in the sense that I don't have to deal with them. And they're made less safe in the sense that they now have to deal with the police. Right? And although he never quite says it explicitly, I take Friedman as questioning the morality of that trade-off, especially when we're making less safe somebody who is already fundamentally unsafe in that capacious conception that he's talking about. Can we really reduce the safety of the homeless to increase the safety of all the rest of us who would want to enjoy life without having to deal with them? And I think that philosopher John Rawls gives us some reason to think about the immorality of that choice. He articulated a principle called the difference principle. And what the difference principle states is that when we're distributing social goods, the inequality is only permissible to the extent that it improves the position of the least well off. And so, under the difference principle, right, if the homeless are already less safe in this capacious sense, then we're not permitted to make them less safe in the narrow sense of sending police to deal with them. Right? That even if doing so improves the safety of other people, we can't reduce their safety to increase our own. And like Nussbaum, Rawls grounds his difference principle argument in a theory of fundamental human dignity. So let me pause here to admit one thing, which is that I might be reaching. Right? At times, Friedman says things that sound like these political philosophers, and so my own view is also very much in line with theirs. I work extensively in the area of human dignity. At other times, Friedman hints that his views might be more nuanced. It's equally plausible, for example, that his theory of our capacious conception of public safety that includes things like transportation is just based on notions of government promise-keeping. He says that a couple times in his paper. And truthfully, right, his approach to the distributional effects of public safety could be much more straightforwardly utilitarian cost-benefit analysis than I'm thinking. But if I'm right about the connection to human dignity and the connection to these philosophers, I want to encourage Friedman to be thinking more explicitly in that language, the language of human dignity. Constitutionally, public safety is just a phrase that we invoke whenever we want to empower the government to control its citizens. Human dignity, by contrast, has place in our constitutional jurisprudence to restrain the government and to empower citizens. And so if Friedman wants to eventually obligate the government to extend rights and to satisfy duties in the way that he sort of suggests, right, I think that there's practical value, strategic value, in calling this a theory of human dignity rather than a theory of public safety. All right, that's the philosophy. Let's talk about law for a second. Right? Given the way his philosophical commitments unfold, I'm genuinely surprised by Barry Friedman's approach to two particular cases. The first one is Martin versus City of Boise. Now, he didn't talk about it today. He writes about it extensively in his paper. The case came out of the Ninth Circuit, and it's an Eighth Amendment ruling that says you can't criminalize homelessness if the homeless people have no available shelter. And so the case has been praised by many people for that part of the ruling. And that is a benefit as far as it goes. But Friedman also uses this case to say something more. Right? What the case says is, if there is public shelter available, then it's okay to criminalize homelessness. Right? And in the written version of this lecture, Professor Friedman says that that would be conduct worthy of criminalization. That the choice not to use shelter when it's available, right, that's a choice, as opposed to the other stuff. And here's where I think the Martin opinion doesn't go far enough. Right? Under Rawls's difference principle, it's not enough that we give the homeless just any old alternative. It needs to be an alternative that genuinely improves their position. But studies show us that as many as 77% of homeless individuals, right, prefer to live on the street versus staying in a shelter. And I think that's a rational decision for many homeless individuals. Shelters are dangerous. Right? Diseases are common in shelters. Property theft is rampant in shelters. Shelters are frequently sex segregated, which means that people are cut off from their friends, from their family, from their children, from their support networks. And so, as long as shelters of the kind that we're providing aren't providing a uniformly beneficial experience for homeless individuals, then I don't think that it's sustainable through a Rawlsian lens. I don't think it's sustainable under the difference principle. And for that reason, I think that it's hard to see why Friedman embraces that opinion as much as he does. I think it needs to go farther. But the most surprising thing to me about Friedman's lecture is that it ends with a call for what sounds to me a lot like more policing. And this suggestion is baked into his claim that what we need to do is overturn a Supreme Court case called DeShaney versus Winnebago County. Now, DeShaney is undeniably tragic. A young boy lost his life at the hands of his father at a time when the state was arguably in a position to intervene. What the Supreme Court said is that the government owes no obligation to intervene in private violence. That actually, to Brandon's point, right, the police owe no duty to intervene in the instance of violence. They can step back as well. And we might think that that's inherently like unjust. But I want to step away from the facts, and I want to think about what it would mean for DeShaney to come out the other way. It means that the government would be affirmatively obligated to be everyone's personal protector from all third-party harms. It means that children would be separated from their parents anytime we need to investigate potential abuse. It means that we would address domestic violence through failed policies like mandatory arrests, right, or mandatory separation orders. It means that the government, and police in particular, would need to be continually and actively intervening in the lives of citizens to ensure a very narrow kind of public safety, not the capacious sense that Barry talks about. Now, I suspect that Professor Friedman does this because he believes that a governmental duty of that kind is a necessary first step to giving a duty to things like the clean air and clean water and public schools. Right? But I think from a human dignity perspective, we might actually question whether obligating the government to act won't just lead to more and more expensive policing. Right now, we're in a criminal justice moment where support for the police might be at its lowest. People are calling for defunding or even wholesale abolition of police departments. And at the heart of these movements is really a call for more community control. The typical places for reallocated police funding are things like schools, housing, jobs, healthcare. So the capacious conception of public safety that Barry Friedman argues for might actually be better achieved by reinvesting money away from policing and into some of these other services. And it's surprising to me that Friedman didn't meaningfully mention reforms like these. Instead, he comes to us with an idea of a new first responder, policing on top of policing. And so I think his call to overturn DeShaney feels in tension with both the current moment and his broader commitment to dignity. So to sum up, Friedman invites us to rethink the concept of public safety. And I think that his capacious conception of public safety is very promising. Properly understood, I think that it instructs us to ensure the basic human dignity of every individual. And I'm on board with that. But I believe that in some cases, public safety necessarily means reducing government in order to create space for individual and community autonomy. For me, it means decriminalizing many of the behaviors attendant to homelessness so that those who are homeless have the space to decide for themselves how best to be safe. And it means investing in solving the social causes of private violence, even if it comes at the expense of addressing the private violence itself. Above all else, I think it means thinking deeply about the values to which we're committed and asking whether the state as we know it is really the right vehicle to be delivering upon it. And so I invite Barry to think similarly about his own commitments, both to human dignity and to the legal prescriptions that he embraces in his paper and in his talk. Upon inspection, I think there's a separation between those commitments. And I think there's a new possibility for public safety there. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, guys. I know we're just a wee bit over, but I want to close by giving Professor Friedman an opportunity to make a few comments, if he'd like, or responses before we call it a close. Professor Friedman?
Thank you. I actually don't need more than a minute, and I feel bad that we don't have time for more Q&A, and I hope there's a chance to fix that at some point. We're all long-winded because we're all law professors and professors of different sorts. I actually don't think I need to say a word. I mean, I would say more about Ben's comments than anyone because I just am skeptical that we're going to achieve any of this without the state. Last time we thought that the state might wither away, it turned out not to be so successful, and I don't think that will be true now. But I actually, the reaction I had to pretty much everything everybody had to say, and I wrote it more than once here, was fair point. So thank you all. I think you do me and the topic great justice by being so thoughtful and sometimes depressing in the things that you have to say, but still thoughtful. And Eric, I'm going to just turn it back to you to thank everybody once again.
Great. Thank you so much. Let's call it a close right now. I want to thank our commentators, Trevor Gardner, Maria Ponomorenko, Brandon Del Pozo, and my colleague Ben McJunkin for terrific commentary. Of course, I want to thank Professor Barry Friedman for an enlightening lecture on an incredibly important topic, and what a privilege it has been to have you here and throughout the day. I want to thank all of you for coming here. I know the students here were required, at least mine were. Thank you very much. But I'm also really thrilled to see members of the ASU community more generally and members of the law enforcement community here to take on this very important discussion. So what I'd like to do is to encourage all of you to continue the conversation respectfully in the time of plague. I'm going to direct you towards lunch because lunch is next. For all of our audience members, there is going to be box lunches that are going to be outside that door. For some of you, will be participants in an executive session. If you had made your order, they'll be available for you in room 555. If you didn't put in an order and are in the executive session, please grab a lunch, and then one of us will escort you up there. But then, once again, thank you all for coming here, and thank you so much, Professor Friedman, for such a wonderful lecture. Have a great day, guys.